So right now we're shifting into an hour of talking about the various cluster projects that we've been working on at OHCOW, and many of you in the audience and at home or at the office and others have been involved in those cluster projects around the province. And the first person we're going to hear from is Andrew Zarnke, who's a project coordinator for the McIntyre project and now the GE project. And he's going to talk about his research on particle characterization related to McIntyre powder and how that's relevant to disease. Andrew. There you are. Great. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really cool to be able to put together a lot of the work I've been doing for my PhD research and also work that I've been doing for OHCOW and kind of putting it together. So it's a unique opportunity that I've gotten. So I'm going to first start with just a summary or an introduction to McIntyre powder, just for people that aren't fully aware of what McIntyre powder was. Talk about some of the preliminary work we've done on the particle characterization and chemical characterization of McIntyre powder, and also physiological responses to inhaled fine and ultrafine airborne particles, the implications of PM2.5 or fine particles and McIntyre powder exposure in cardiovascular disease, and how McIntyre powder potentially could contribute to the development of disease. So first, McIntyre powder was developed in response to a very high prevalence of pulmonary fibrosis, silicosis, specifically from the inhalation of crystalline silica. So back in the early 40s all the way into the 50s and 60s, there was relatively high, very high levels of crystalline silica in the mining environment. So the McIntyre Research Foundation was formed, and their goal was to come up with a way to prevent miners from getting silicosis. And their response to that was this finely ground aluminum powder that underground miners were forced to breathe in order to coat their lungs with aluminum in hopes of reducing the solubility of crystalline silica in their lungs and preventing them from getting pulmonary fibrosis. So it was used from 1943 until about 1979. There was some mines that used it into 1980. There was approximately 27,500 underground miners that were exposed to McIntyre powder in Ontario alone. It was mandatory, and if you refused, you would be sent home without pay and sometimes fired for not complying. So this is what a McIntyre powder canister looks like. It's about the diameter of a toonie. The recommended dose by the McIntyre Research Foundation was 1 gram per 1,000 cubic feet of locker room air or change room air for 10 minutes. So the 10 minutes was came up with, that was the average time that a miner would take to get changed and ready for their shift. So they kind of adjusted the in-air concentration based on that time. So this is an image on the right of the actual, the McIntyre mine in Timmins where it was tested and developed. And that's an image of the black cloud of aluminum dust being blown out of a compressed line. And basically this dose was actually used as a simple way for mines that this was used in to calculate how many 10-gram canisters they needed to use. So in this instance, the McIntyre mine had 80,000 cubic feet of space. These were big locker rooms. So they had to use 8 canisters. And essentially how it would be done is 1 can at a time, you'd put this canister into a compressed airline. You would dispense the dust, which would take maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then you would hold that air open for about 1 minute to allow an admixture of the air to kind of try and homogenize the dust within the environment. And then you would move to the subsequent corner, and they were all done in the 4 corners of the dry, as it was called in the mining industry. So you would sit in there in that whole period of time with the ventilation closed, the door locked, the seals were all designed on the doors to keep this dust inside while they dispersed it, and then you were meant to sit in there for 10 minutes while after it was dispersed. So that's why you see a lot of accounts of the miners saying that their exposures were actually more than 10 minutes. A lot of times they were upwards of 30 minutes. So we can use those, that valuable information for some of our exposure assessments as well. So when I was introduced to McIntyre Powder, I was researching actually the biological responses to low doses of radiation. I work in a lab with Dr. Douglas Borum at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and he brought this to me, and I was looking at the effects of low doses of radon on a biological level, a mechanistic level. And he thought this fit in really well with my PhD research. He said we had some really interesting questions about how McIntyre powder could interact, like many people have been talking about these mixed exposures. These miners weren't just exposed to McIntyre powder, they're exposed to radon, diesel exhaust, silica, ambient mine dust, arsenic, and uranium, depending on whether you're a gold or uranium miner. So our question really was, how did McIntyre powder or aluminum interact with the radiation they were getting from radon gas? So before we could really start to answer those questions, we had to really understand what McIntyre powder was. I mean, McIntyre powder is a product. Everybody said it was an aluminum dust, but until you actually know what those physical characteristics are of the powder, what the chemical makeup is, to be able to draw any meaningful conclusions from any experiments that we were going to run, we truly need to know what was in there. So this is the findings from that study. It was published last month in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Hygiene. It will be in the November issue. It's free to download, it's open access, so everybody's welcome to go there and have a look at what we published there. And what we did was we did an analysis of the elemental composition, the mineralogical composition, and what I'm mostly going to be focusing on today is the particle size analysis. We did 3 different types of particle size analyses. We did dynamic light scattering, transmission electron microscopy, or TEM, and atomic force microscopy, or AFM. And on the right, you can see a representative image of the atomic force microscopy. And this shows some of the smallest particles of McIntyre powder that we were able to detect. And we see the scale bar is 1.5 microns on the bottom, and some of those particles are estimated at 5 nanometers in size. So what does that mean? Let's put that into context. This is kind of a biological size scale of where these fit within the biological system of our bodies. So going from the adult body all the way down to the atom, and we see what we found was McIntyre powder roughly was between 2 microns and 5 nanometers. So you can see the other big players in the picture here are the alveolus, which is the lowest part of the respiratory tract and where the gas exchange occurs in our lungs. And then the alveolar macrophage, which is the main source of clearance of these particles that reach that lower part of the lung. So to put it into context, you can see that the smallest particles of McIntyre powder actually were close to the same size as a single lipid molecule in a single cell in our bodies. And it's been shown that in the last 10 years, a lot of research being done on nanomaterials, that they can actually enter into the cell. So it's not just cellular responses, but subcellular responses that we can start to investigate. So it's important to understand that particle size is very important because particle deposition in the lung is a size-dependent thing. So the first 2 definitions here, inhalable and respirable fraction, are things that you can find in the ACGIH TLV book. And just in general terms, there's complicated definitions of what those things are, but inhalable is anything that has a high probability of just entering the respiratory tract, and it's generally thought of particles that are below 10 microns. The respirable fraction is particles that can have a high probability of being deposited in the lower respiratory tract, and generally thought of below 4 microns. And now in the literature, we're finding that smaller particles are really what is having the major biological effect. So now you can see in the literature we have new definitions, PM 2.5, which are particulate matter below 2.5 microns, and then there's other definitions called fine particulates, which is anything below 2.5 microns. And then also now with this whole idea of nanoparticles, engineered nanoparticles, we have ultrafine and nanoparticles as a definition of particles below 100 nanometers. So if we look at the respiratory tract there's some major differences in the physiology of the lung. So in the upper respiratory tract, we have ciliated epithelium, that beat in action with each other, and it works with this mucus layer that acts as a conveyor belt that can really effectively remove particles from our lung. But when you look at the really lower region, these ball-like structures called the alveoli, it's a smooth epithelium, and it's a very thin epithelium, and it's very closely related to the vasculature. And in that region, the only way that particles can be removed is by those alveolar macrophages. And they're able to recognize and engulf foreign particles and pathogens, and through chemotaxis, move that particle up into this mucus conveyor belt system so it can be actively removed or expelled or ingested. So let's look at the McIntyre powder exposure again, a little bit of an exposure assessment. So if we take the 1 gram per 1,000 cubic feet for 10 minutes, and we just do a straight conversion, unit conversion down to milligrams per meter cubed, something that we all recognize a unit for much better, it equates to 35.3 milligrams per meter cubed. So if we time weight that, so we can compare it to all the other occupational limits, it's 0.74 milligrams per meter cubed. So there's a big difference there. And at first, when I was coming from a radiation background, dose rate is a really huge, important thing when it comes to the biological response to radiation. And when I saw that they were taking 35 milligrams per meter cubed, and they were saying, well, that's the same as getting 0.74 milligrams per meter cubed over 8 hours, I just thought there's got to be something going on there. There's got to be a difference in the biological response. So when you look into the Occupational Health Act, there is things in place to prevent these types of peak exposures and to control for them. And they're called excursion limits. And basically what it says is that any substance cannot exceed or should not exceed 3 times the exposure limit for 30 minutes or 5 times the exposure limit at any time. So if we compare that to the limit for aluminum in compounds, which is 1 milligram per meter cubed, respirable fraction, which we now know McIntyre powder is completely respirable, McIntyre powder exposure would be 7 times the current excursion limit. So during lung overload conditions, what happens is these alveolar macrophages become overwhelmed with particles. And what's been shown in the literature is that these things get confused. Their chemotaxis properties don't work anymore, so they don't go in the right direction. They don't know which way the street is going, and they can end up being deposited into the epithelium or enter into the lymphatics or the circulatory system. And it's also been shown that the smaller the particles, the easier it is for it to induce this process of lung overload. And during lung overload, because the half-life of the particles within the lung is longer, there's more opportunity for translocation to other parts of the body. So now I'm going to transition into another topic that we've been investigating a lot as a part of the McIntyre exposed group, is we've seen a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease in the exposed miners. So we started looking into the literature and saying, is there a link between or something related to McIntyre powder or dust exposure in cardiovascular disease? And the WHO recognizes 31% of all mortality worldwide is due to cardiovascular disease. And we all know these common risk factors, that are smoking, unhealthy diets, lack of physical activity, obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. And these are all things, in most part, can be affected by healthy life choices. So they're controllable. But what about environmental factors? So in 2018, the WHO reported approximately 7 million premature deaths per year caused by exposure to fine particulates. And a recent study by Lelyveld et al. In 2019 estimated in 2015 that there was 8.79 million deaths worldwide attributable to air pollution, with the strongest association to PM2.5 exposure. So these small particulate matter, the smallest fraction in the air pollution. So let's put this into perspective. So the WHO estimates that excess death rate from tobacco smoking is 7.2 million per year. Therefore, now based on these new estimates, PM2.5 exposure could be considered a larger risk factor for cardiovascular disease than smoking. So I'm just going to go quickly over some of these summary points that we've put together and some of the literature that we've been putting out and some of the reports we've been putting together, and just to kind of give an overview of some of the the ideas about how McIntyre powder can contribute to disease. McIntyre powder should be considered 100% PM2.5 and under the ACGIH definitions, entirely respirable. And through the scientific literature, we know now that PM2.5 poses the greatest health risk for cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. Come on. And within the scientific literature, it also suggests that there is a strong dose-response relationship between PM2.5 and cardiac and pulmonary disease. The small particles and high dose rate of McIntyre powder favor conditions for lung overload. These conditions provide opportunity for McIntyre powder particles to translocate from the lung into the lymphatics and to the circulatory system. The 24-hour time-weighted average, so if we just accept the fact that we want to time-weight this over 24 hours, just so we can draw comparison between the epidemiological studies that look at PM2.5 levels over a 24-hour period, that would equate to 240 micrograms per meter cubed. This would be 24 times higher the standard increment increase in PM2.5 used in all cardiovascular epidemiological studies, which is 10 micrograms per meter cubed. The association between PM2.5 exposure and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality in the epidemiological literature suggests that McIntyre powder exposed workers are at high risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And the associations between PM2.5 exposure and cerebrovascular disease implicate McIntyre powder in neurological health outcomes, including ischemic stroke and cognitive dysfunction. And one of the main points that right away was apparent to me was the nature of the way that it was administered. The fact that they were treating diseases that were caused by dust in their workplace by giving them more dust. That just inherently just seems like a recipe for disaster. And the fact that this was such a high dose of dust being added to the lungs directly before going underground into a dusty environment where there was dust, there was ambient mine dust, there was silica dust. You know, there's a common word here, dust. Like there's so many forms of dust that can cause cancer down in the mine, and you just inundated a person's lungs with dust. So that's the main point that I want to highlight, and that's something that we don't see addressed in a lot of the responses to some of the claims that we're submitting to the WSIB. So I think a lot of these points need to be addressed, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done, and we're actively pushing forward with a lot of our in vitro and cell culture experiments looking at the interactive effects between nanoparticulate exposure and radiation, and also looking at McIntyre powder in that as well. So thank you very much. I also just want to put a plug out for our nanotechnology and health group that Kimberly introduced earlier. So this is an infographic that we were a big part of, and Todd Irick, one of our senior hygienists in Ottawa, has really been pushing that forward, and it's available on their website, and it's got a lot of cool information about identifying nano materials in the workplace and some of the possible health effects, and where to get some of the resources related to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anybody have any quick questions for Andrew? Lots of information, and thanks for all those calculations, but it's pretty depressing, actually, though. What was the question?
No, it's not a question, but Andrew,
Can you hang on,
I
sir?
am one
Wait,
of the guys
wait for a mic.
smiling on my left.
Okay.
Oh,
Here,
you're a
I'll-
doctor.
I just want to tell you, it's great information you have provided. I am one of the probably only guy in this room who was exposed to the McIntyre powder in my earlier days of work with the Ministry of Natural Resources. I was one of those guys who went to take some silica samples to do XRD on them, because I was developing the X-ray diffraction method for the Ministry of Labor. And so they said you should go and collect the actual samples from the Elliott Lake mines. And that got me into Elliott Lake mines a few times. And every time you had to sit in that room, inhale for 10 minutes, and then go in. So now time to go to WSIB, I guess. Yeah, thanks for the information. Yeah, bye-bye.
That question leads to mine. Has the WSIB been fully cooperative in paying out McIntyre Powder claims?
Well, I mean, the only thing that they've recognized it in is COPD, which they've recognized, basically recognizing it as a dust, and it's been using the 0.74 milligram per meter cube number. It's been incorporated into a cumulative dust exposure calculations to help bolster COPD claims. But that's been the biggest, the only kind of headway we've made there. So.
Great. Okay, now I'd like to welcome Dr. T. Guadati, who assisted us last year and is back to talk about, as I titled it, a new lens on the research, but he's actually focusing on a specific report around McIntyre Powder as well. Thanks, T.
Thanks, Valerie. Just to fill in a couple of points before talking about the specific topic of the presentation, which is a review of a report that was produced for the ministry the WSIB in 2017. I'd like to just fill in a couple of gaps, actually. The first is that the introduction of McIntyre Powder as a prophylactic treatment to prevent silicosis wasn't completely arbitrary. May have been ill-advised, and it may have been premature, and it may have been unevaluated, and it may have been ethically questionable. But there were on the plus side, it wasn't completely arbitrary because there had been a series of studies that were done, started at Saranac Lake, New York, which had a very prestigious experimental toxicology laboratory that developed a model for silicosis, an experimental model. And that model was used by the Banting Research Institute, as in Sir Frederick Banting. So there was a lot of prestige because Banting's name was associated with some of the earliest studies of aluminum, and they didn't know how it worked, and they thought that it did coat the particles, but what it actually was doing was impeding the macrophage's ability to swallow the particles. Now that, in a sense, is not intrinsically a bad thing, because a large part of the problem with silicosis has to do with the cycle in which the macrophage consumes the particle kills the macrophage disintegrates, and the particle repeats the process with another macrophage. At the time, though, they didn't know that, so they were really flying blind. And all they knew was that in rats, it seemed to work in that particular model. In that particular model also, they found out a little bit later that aluminum powder caused a fibrotic or a lung scarring condition in rats, which later got the name of Shaver's disease. So they were kind of trading off some things, but they didn't realize what they were doing at the time. But it wasn't completely arbitrary because they did have these animal studies to start with. Nobody was doing clinical trials at that point. And in fact, in occupational health, we almost never get clinical trials, period. So it would have been a particular innovation had they kept records and really figured out whether it was working or not. They didn't, so there was no signal that would have let them know that what they were doing actually wasn't effective at all, and that they were potentially trading an unknown exposure with unknown consequences for a known exposure with admittedly high consequences. So they were very much flying in the dark back then, but flying in the dark in part at least because the critical studies hadn't been done or even conceived of. I personally became interested in this problem in 1972 because I had a pathology professor in medical school who was interested in this and put me onto it as a kind of a novelty. Then later on I realized that it had some importance when I met individuals who had actually been exposed at a conference in 1981. But at that point, I wasn't in a position to do anything about it. Now, the Intrinsic Report, if I can go back for a minute, as I mentioned earlier, was a report that was, oh, sorry. I don't know what happened there. That should have been 2017 Intrinsic Report. Well, I won't change it here, but the I'm not sure how that crept in. At any rate, in 2017, the company Intrinsic developed a report for the WSIB, which had to do with what adverse effects may have been caused by aluminum powder, and they the interest was always on dementia and the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And the reason for that is that for many years we've known that aluminum has some complicated relationship with the development of Alzheimer's. At first, it was thought that aluminum exposure in general caused Alzheimer's disease. And that seemed to make sense because of a couple of clues, much of it having to do with people who were on dialysis who were aluminum overloaded. Later, pathologists began to realize that damaged brain tissue accumulates aluminum. So it became an issue of cause and effect, which came first. Couldn't really be sure about that. So but the focus on neurodegenerative diseases, in particular Alzheimer's, was the main issue and the motivating factor for the studies that eventually were done on miners who were exposed to McIntyre powder. The Intrinsic Report, however, pulled in all kinds of neurological disorders and other conditions. So when you read the Intrinsic Report, one of the things that's so frustrating about it is that there's a lot going on. 3 neurodegenerative diseases, all three of which are quite different, and the other 2 aren't anything like Alzheimer's, are all discussed in the report as if they were germane to this fundamental question. And then you have the throwing in a lot of other conditions and a lot of other exposure situations, which makes the report rather difficult to read because it's not focused laser-like on the essential question, which is whether McIntyre powder exposure was linked to the development of dementias, in particular Alzheimer's. Now, in order to get oriented to the things I'm going to say next, it's important to realize certain things from the beginning. And one of them is that Alzheimer's disease is difficult to diagnose. It's not that easy to diagnose in the middle stages, although it's pretty obvious when it's advanced. But in the early stages, there really is no way to diagnose it, and we're a long way from a reliable early diagnosis, although there's some progress being made now. There are a number of other dementias that look like Alzheimer's. Some of them, believe me, are much worse in terms of causing a lot of distress and anxiety compared to classic Alzheimer's. But there are other causes of dementias. They tend to look alike in the early stages, difficult to sort out. They rarely kill people outright. So an Alzheimer's disease patient is much more likely, particularly if they live a long time, to die of a pneumonia, for example, an aspiration pneumonia, or of a fall and the complications thereof, and so forth. So Alzheimer's disease is almost always an underlying cause of mortality, almost never the major or the stated cause of death, and that means it's not recorded on death certificates. Because it's not recorded on death certificates, about the worst possible way to study Alzheimer's disease is by a mortality study looking at death certificates. Guess what methodology people have used over and over again to study this problem? And the reason is that death certificates are available. So it's a lot like the old joke about why are you looking under the spotlight for the contact lens you lost down the block? Well, the reason is the light's better. And there's no other really good reason to do a mortality study for that, and that's not a particularly good reason. Now, prevalence studies in which you look at the prevalence of certain symptoms, or you look at the presence of abnormal test results, are much better, much more focused on a cause of morbidity as opposed to mortality, morbidity being sickness, and disability as opposed to death. But they're much more difficult to do, as you can imagine. There's nobody conveniently coding it on a death certificate for you. You have to actually get in there and study the individual. The individuals who are at risk right now, of course, are aging out. So the cohort of miners who were exposed to McIntyre powder is basically, to use the epidemiologic term, they're aging out to extinction, which essentially means that this is all the information we're likely ever to have. From this point forward, we're going to have models and we're going to have animal studies. We're not going to have individual populations. We're not going to have populations to study. We may have individuals. Another thing that's important to know from the start is that you cannot compare exposure to McIntyre powder, which is, as the ingredients listed indicate, metallic aluminum and aluminum oxide, to other exposures just because aluminum is in the title. For example, if you examine the aluminum industry, one of the things that strikes you is that aluminum smelting workers are exposed to just about everything but aluminum. Their major exposure, in fact, is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And that has to do with the way that the electrolysis process operates in aluminum smelting. Similarly, aluminum arc welding produces a very different kind of aerosol. Aluminum metalworking is a little bit different, and so forth. And pyrotechnics, which have to do with firework displays and so forth, in the past, and there's been a lot of discussion of this, had to do with making powder under oil. And it was thought that the oil itself changed the bioavailability characteristics of the aluminum and changed the process, because some of those people actually did get dementia. And that was one of the little shreds of evidence that started people off in this direction. Well, the Intrinsic Report spends a lot of time on the aluminum industry, and that's pretty pointless. So, with that background, it may surprise you to know that we have lots of mortality data on McIntyre powder. None of it particularly helpful, none of it particularly useful. One abstract basically didn't even report the findings. It basically said they only they didn't see an elevation. But actually, this particular study was inconclusive and shouldn't be confused with a properly reported scientific study, because it didn't even communicate the number of people who were studied. There was another study that was done in Western Australia, and interestingly enough, remember I said all the things against, or that mitigated against, finding anything unusual in a mortality study, because mortality studies are intrinsically bad for a bad model for studying this disease. They found an elevation. Now, it didn't rise to the level of statistical significance, but that's a pretty hard bar to declare with a relatively small population. So you have this non-significant increase, and not a small increase either, about 40% excess mortality. And even more compellingly, there was an exposure-response relationship. Well, that's one of the prime things we look for if we were trying to look for things that are causal as opposed to associated by chance alone. So here you have a study model that shouldn't show anything because it's very poorly designed for this kind of condition. And you've seen and we see not only an increase, but an exposure-response relationship. In spite of the fact that if you do the power calculations, you would only expect to find a difference of this magnitude 1 in 10 times. In other words, the design is so poor that it misses a positive finding about 90% of the time, and yet here it shows up. That's kind of unusual. So you have to consider this to be suggestive. However, the intrinsic study dismisses it as negative. Rafat, who is the author who is primarily concerned with, or primarily identified with these studies, started with a mortality component. She wasn't really interested in mortality because she knew all this and knew that it was a poor study design, but she was concerned with how much selection bias it introduced into the study that she really cared about, which I'll talk about in a moment. And what she found was that, interestingly enough, there was about a 40% increase in mortality from in the group of miners who were exposed to McIntyre powder compared to those who were not. Now, you have to take this with a grain of salt because it was unadjusted and unstandardized. But she did report this finding. Nobody picked up on it. And, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what was the cause of this 40% mortality? Well, we just heard a rationale about cardiovascular disease, which is the single most likely reason why a mortality result would diverge by that much. But because they didn't do the study by cause of death, we don't know that for sure. What we do know is that they didn't observe in that mortality study an increase from neurological disease, but then it was grossly underpowered and was really, I think, couldn't detect it in even if it was there. So I think that this study also had to be considered to be negative, but it was considered to be negative, but it's actually inconclusive. Now, moving on to where the real money is, the prevalence studies. This is what Rafat was really set out to do in the first place, and is the important finding of the study. In 1988, they started to do a series of studies on as many miners as they could find who were still relatively healthy in other ways, in other words, who weren't obviously impaired and who didn't have other conditions that caused dementia. They didn't find much in terms of diagnosed dementia cases, but what they did in a classic prevalence model was they did tests that would indicate the possible presence of cognitive dysfunction. So they were actually doing tests, not clinical tests, but screening tests of a kind that would be typical for an epidemiologic study of neurological conditions, and tried to see if there was a change. I'm going to go back to Rafat's other work in a moment, but you should know going into this discussion that they did a follow-up study in 1994 that unfortunately they didn't publish. So Intrinsic didn't look very hard for it, or at least didn't include it, but it's a Freedom of Information Act request produced it finally, and what we do know is that this particular group had probably quite different characteristics, and they couldn't repeat the earlier studies from 1988, but there were many things that were different about this population. So anyway, going back to 1988, which was the basis for a paper that was published in 1990 that had a huge impact, they used these three common tests of neurocognitive function, and they tested the exposed and unexposed miners. They used pretty standard effects, and what they determined was that there were statistically significant differences. In other words, 95% certainty differences, real statistically significant at a scientific level, in the scores between those who had been exposed and those who were unexposed, with the exposed workers performing more poorly. This was true for overall performance, and as you can see, each of the, especially those of you with backgrounds in psychology or with clinical evaluations, can see that the three tests basically test somewhat different things, but they're all basically in the domain of cognitive function. What they found was that overall performance decline was less for the exposed workers, that there was impairment in at least one test score in one of these three tests, actual impairment of clinical significance in the exposed workers more often than the unexposed. And there was also a correlation, again, an exposure-response relationship, between the frequency of impairment and the duration of the exposure. In other words, how long these people had worked and had been exposed to McIntyre powder. So this was rather significant, and this study had excellent power. This had by far the most power of any of the tests that we'll discuss today. It had a 99% chance of identifying an effect that was actually present. So by any reasonable standard, the Rafat study of 1988 was in fact positive, showed clear evidence for neurocognitive impairment for workers who had been exposed. Now in 1994, again in collaboration with WSIB and the IWH, Rafat conducted a follow-up study that never got published. This study was more or less similar in that they used the same tests, but they also did something a little bit different, and that's that they had a panel of neuropsychologists evaluate responses from the subjects that to see if there was evidence in their opinion of clinical evidence of dementia. And it was a smaller group, 150 something compared to 256, and it was a highly selected group because they retained some people from the original group. They retained more people who had positive tests on the original group, put them all together, and frankly, I think that we don't really know who the people were that they did study because the mixing and matching in the base population obscures the simple dichotomy of exposed or unexposed. In other words, the subject selection was very complicated, and I think that it may have confounded the results. At any rate, there was no difference between any groups on any parameter. It didn't seem to matter if people were exposed or unexposed, how old they were, etc. There didn't seem to be disproportionate representation in the exposed groups, although there were cases of neurological impairment. And the bottom line is this study just really doesn't have a clear signal. It doesn't tell us what's going on. Why is that? Well, my own feeling is that we simply don't know what the population was because there was so much selection bias and unknown biases in the study that were never measured. We simply don't know. So that's an inconclusive study. Now, the Intrinsic Report in 2017 was commissioned to make sense of all this and to provide a recommendation that would guide the WSIB. And my own personal opinion is here that I think that a lot of irrelevancy in the report, things that really don't inform the conclusions. They mixed up neurological conditions and talked about things that that really are unrelated to the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's. So they don't discuss 1994 at all, and they tend to minimize the significance of the 1990 findings, and I think it's a little biologically naive as well. So other than that, it's great. But it's, I think that as a report, if one of my students had done it, I would have been a little harsh with them. So one of the things that I had most difficulty with is their use of what's called the Hill criteria. Those of you who have had any contact with epidemiology are well aware of the Hill criteria, which have to do with indications or notionally tests that might indicate that an association that you see, statistically significant or not, is causal as opposed to an exposure by chance alone. This is one of the fundamental issues in epidemiology, and Sir Austin Bradford Hill, whose surname, by the way, was Hill, not Bradford Hill, wrote a critically important article that appeared in I think it was 65, that basically said, if you're looking for an association that may be causal, here are some things to look for, because if they show these signs, they're more likely to be a cause than just a chance association or a confounding effect. Hill was no dummy. He realized perfectly well that you can have a causal association and miss these things, particularly if you have bad studies. And he also knew perfectly well that you can miss an association that's actually there if you have bad studies or if the effect is small enough. So in his 1965 paper, he wrote long and detailed warnings about misusing his criteria. Well, guess what? My own personal feeling is that the Intrinsic Report is a classic case of misuse of the Hill criteria, because they go through the whole laundry list and they act like it's a checklist of things to tick. Well, first of all, the mortality studies are useless, so except with the possible exception of the Western Australian one, which was better documented. And when you're looking at a single association, in this case with neurocognitive disorder, and you only have one study that gives you a clearer picture, you can't apply a set of criteria that were designed in the first place to be applied to a body of evidence. And the Hill criteria is fundamentally about a body of evidence. If you have no body of evidence, the Hill criteria can't be used. And please remember that when cases come through with opinions being written that use the Hill criteria to question individual cases, you cannot use the Hill criteria that way. That is an abuse of epidemiologic methodology. Bradford Hill recognized that. He cautioned against it, and I think he also had a very humanitarian and humane view of what he was doing. He realized that statistics help a lot in terms of advancing science. It helps a lot in terms of rationalizing the health care, and it allows us to focus our public health priority. But fundamentally, reducing people to statistics is an administrative and a management necessity. These numbers are people, and these numbers represent uncertainty with all the dimensions of incomplete documentation, with people moving around, with errors that creep into to records, and so forth. And we account for these as best we can, but fundamentally we have to realize that the basis of epidemiologic research are people, and we're trying to reflect the actual lived experience of actual people, and sometimes we can only do that imperfectly. It is the imperfections that we have to be aware of and account for, and we have to be aware that certainty is not achievable. Statistical significance in the scientific sense is virtually impossible, particularly for the first case of an unusual or a novel situation. We will probably, in my opinion, never know the answer to a statistically significant level of certainty in terms of neurocognitive dysfunction and McIntyre powder, for the simple reason that these people are not going to be around to study any longer. But we have indications. We have one study that hits the mark, and at this point, that's all we've got. And we have to have a little humility about where the uncertainty lies, and address the problem humanely. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Here's a little token of our gratitude. Does anybody have any questions for T right now? So although we promised lunch at 12 o'clock, it's actually just been delivered and is getting set up. And we still have Dave here to talk about some of the other projects. So I think maybe we'll at least get started with that, Dave, if you're okay. But did no one had a question for T right now? Are you staying, T, through lunch so that people can ask him questions directly if they want to? But I know there's a lot of people interested in the cluster project, so it would be great to, Dave, if you want to come. Do you have your, okay.
Question
and then,
from the web, Val?
Pardon me?
There's one from the web.
Okay, yeah.
What is considered an appropriate body of evidence to which Hill's criteria can be applied?
Okay. So the question, do you want to repeat it, John?
Sure. What is considered an appropriate body of evidence to which Hill's criteria can be applied?
Well, I think at a minimum, it would be a body of evidence that's robust, that is diverse, that looks at each of the individual criteria on either different populations or using different analyses with sufficient accuracy. And because consistency is such an important part of the Hill criteria, you would have to have, ideally, multiple studies in the that address the same criterion. Now, you can achieve that readily in many clinical questions, because it's relatively easy to do a clinical study in a hospital, and somewhat less easy, but the facilities exist to do a clinical trial in, for example, for cancer research in multiple institutions. You can't do it on just one study, and you can't do it when the body of evidence is so thin that you can't address the criteria.
Thanks, Val. And the person online is also asking if the previous speaker could answer that same question.
Do you want to
Add Andrew, yes, sorry, I'm just...
No, I'm a biologist. I'm not much of a numbers cruncher, so I can't really add anything to that. Thanks, T.
Okay, great.